You spend your life believing you know the person beside you. You memorize their habits, share meals, raise pets, and fall asleep to the rhythm of their breath night after night. You trust that loyalty is mutual, that love is truth, and that after decades together, there are no more secrets left to hide. But what if you were wrong? When 67-year-old Harold Whitmore died in his sleep from what doctors called a silent heart, the grief was sharp but familiar to those who've known long marriages. His wife of 28 years, Darlene, held herself together for the funeral, accepted casseroles from neighbors, and sorted through sympathy cards by the dozens. She believed this was the painful end of a shared chapter, a life lived together, a loss endured alone. Until she received a call from her late husband's attorney. The voice on the other end didn't speak in euphemisms. No warm condolences. No reassurances. Just an appointment and a request to bring identification. 7 days after she buried Harold, Darlene walked into a modest law office expecting closure. What she got instead was a truth so raw it burned. Her husband, faithful, dependable Harold, had taken out a $1.7 million life insurance policy. That much, she expected. What she didn't expect was the name on the paperwork. It wasn't hers. The beneficiary was a woman she had never heard of. Someone who lived in another state. Someone who had no business being tied to her husband's life. Let alone his death. That was the moment Darlene realized the man she buried might not be the man she married. For nearly 3 decades, Harold Whitmore had been the kind of man who rarely raised eyebrows. He wasn't flashy, didn't chase attention, and never lingered too long in any one conversation at community gatherings. He preferred being helpful in quiet ways. Tuning a neighbor's lawn mower, adjusting a loose hinge at the church door, or repairing old transistor radios for the local flea market. To most, Harold was a steady hand in an unsteady world. He wore plain clothes, enjoyed plain meals, and lived a life that seemed, on the surface, built around quiet routines and humble pleasures. At home in a modest 2-story colonial on the outskirts of Rochester, New York, Harold shared a comfortable life with his wife, Darlene. They had married in the fall of 1995 after meeting at a mutual friend's backyard barbecue. Darlene had just come out of a painful divorce, and Harold had been a bachelor at 38, reserved, intelligent, with a calm that made people feel safe. That calm is what first drew Darlene in. They never had children together. Harold said he'd always wanted to be a father, but life had other plans. Darlene, having suffered a miscarriage early in their marriage, eventually stopped pressing the issue. Over time, she accepted that their family unit was just the two of them, and their Labrador, Ginger. They filled their days with routines that brought comfort. Sunday morning breakfasts. Trips to the hardware store. Evenings in the den watching documentaries or reading quietly side by side. Harold's job as a mechanical engineer at an aerospace firm provided them with stability. He'd been with the company for over 25 years, praised for his reliability and attention to detail. When he retired at 62, Darlene threw a small gathering in their backyard, inviting friends, co-workers, and neighbors. No speeches, no drama. Just Harold in his lawn chair, sipping iced tea, smiling as he watched people mingle. That was his way, low-key and observant. And yet, certain patterns began to surface in hindsight, things that, at the time, seemed trivial. If this story gripped you the way it gripped us, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. Your support helps uncover more untold truths and hidden lives behind the headlines. Every March and October, Harold claimed he had to attend technical conferences out of state. Sometimes Boston. Sometimes D.C., occasionally Chicago. Darlene never joined him. She said Harold preferred to travel light. He'd return with brochures, receipts, and vague anecdotes about panel discussions and hotel food. Looking back, she realized how carefully curated those stories were. Just enough detail to sound plausible, never enough to raise suspicion. There was also the matter of Harold's reluctance to embrace technology. He insisted on using a flip phone well into the era of smartphones. Said he didn't trust apps stealing his data. He managed finances the old-fashioned way, ledgers, paper bills, handwritten checkbooks. Even email was used sparingly, if at all. He told Darlene he preferred in-person communication. "It's harder to misread someone's intent when you can see their eyes," he once said. But perhaps the most telling sign was Harold's aversion to deep emotional conversations. When Darlene brought up retirement plans, places she dreamed of visiting, hobbies she wanted to try, he would nod, smile, and say, "Sounds good," but the next day, he'd be back in the garage restoring a broken ham radio or reorganizing his socket set. He never said no. He just redirected. To Darlene, this was just part of his nature. Harold was a quiet man. Thoughtful. Private. She saw those qualities as virtues, not warning signs. That began to shift 2 years before Harold's death. It started with a trip he took to Connecticut. He told Darlene it was a 3-day seminar on retirement investments for engineers. When he returned, he was noticeably distant, more so than usual. He forgot their anniversary that year, the first time in 27 years. Darlene chalked it up to age, or stress. She didn't push. She never had to before. A few months later, she noticed a birthday card addressed to someone named Isabel tucked between Harold's papers. It was unsigned. The envelope was open. She asked about it. He said it belonged to a colleague who had left it in his briefcase by accident. The name meant nothing to her. She believed him. But Harold's health began to change soon after. Subtle at first. He seemed tired more often, less enthusiastic about projects. He began taking long walks alone, no longer accompanied by Ginger. When Darlene offered to go with him, he declined politely, saying he needed time to clear his head. The nightly tea ritual faded. The comfortable silences between them began to feel hollow. One night, he went to bed early, saying he had a headache. Darlene found him the next morning. Unresponsive, eyes closed, hands folded over his chest like he'd simply fallen into a deep, endless sleep. The autopsy confirmed a heart attack. Peaceful. Instantaneous. No pain, the doctor said. Just lights out. At the time, Darlene was grateful for that. He hadn't suffered. It wasn't until a week later, when Harold's lawyer summoned her to discuss the estate, that the quiet life she thought they'd built began to split at the seams. It was supposed to be a routine meeting. A quick reading of the will, some paperwork, and then closure. Darlene arrived at the Whitmore family law office on a gray Wednesday morning still wrapped in the fog of grief. She carried a Ziploc bag with Harold's wedding ring and his wristwatch, items the coroner had returned. In her mind, this meeting was a formality. A sad, inevitable step in the process of letting go. The lawyer, Maurice Brenner, was an old family friend, trusted, measured, discreet. He met her with a solemn handshake, guided her into a wood-paneled room, and poured 2 glasses of water. There was no mention of condolences beyond the initial pleasantries. Instead, Maurice got straight to business. "Darlene," he began, gently sliding a thick folder across the table, "there's something you need to see. And I need you to prepare yourself. What I'm about to show you, it's going to be difficult." Inside the folder were scanned copies of a second will. One Harold had drawn up just 9 months earlier, without her knowledge. The will named a different beneficiary. Not Darlene. Not a sibling or niece. But someone she had never heard of before, Isabel Linden, age 17, listed as Harold's daughter. Darlene sat frozen. She couldn't even find the air to gasp. A child? Harold had no children. He had told her so himself, many times. Maurice explained that the documents had been filed legally and privately, using a sealed clause protected by a third-party trust. It had only surfaced because Harold's death required full probate due to the division of assets. The paper trail was legitimate, notarized, and complete. But more disturbing than the legal mechanics was what came next. There was a life insurance policy, $950,000, designated to Isabel Linden, contingent upon the guardian status of her mother, Teresa Linden. A mother? Another woman? Who was this girl? Who was Teresa? And why had Harold kept it all a secret? It took Darlene 3 days before she summoned the courage to look into it further. She contacted Maurice again, demanding names, phone numbers, anything to help her make sense of the betrayal. He handed her a single sheet with 2 names and 1 address, Dover, Delaware. Darlene drove there herself. What she found would shatter her understanding of everything. The house was a modest brick ranch on a quiet street with a cracked driveway and a basketball hoop nailed crookedly above the garage. She parked across the street and watched for 20 minutes before stepping out. When the front door opened, a young woman, barely 18, answered. Her face, it was unmistakable. The nose. The cheekbones. The eyes. Darlene felt her knees weaken. She was staring into the younger version of her husband's face. That was the moment she called the police. The New Castle County Sheriff's Department initially treated the report as a civil matter, one of disputed inheritance, maybe even fraud. But when Darlene submitted copies of the insurance policy, the secret will, and, most crucially, photographs of Harold visiting the Dover residence on more than one occasion, pulled from an old GPS log on his car's service app, the department opened a formal case. Detective Ariella Dawson, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for uncovering white-collar deception, was assigned to the matter. What began as a probe into financial misconduct quickly darkened. 2 weeks into the inquiry, Detective Dawson discovered that Harold had made 32 undocumented trips to Dover over the past 4 years. None were mentioned in his work logs or family calendar. A further search revealed Harold had rented a storage unit under a different name, Henry Wilson. Less than 5 miles from the Linden residence. When police secured a warrant and entered the unit, what they found changed the trajectory of the case completely. Inside, arranged with disturbing precision, were a cot with clean linens, a mini fridge stocked with drinks, a wall covered in photographs of Isabel Linden at various ages, some school portraits, others candid. Dozens of receipts, letters, and postcards from Uncle H, a pseudonym Harold had used in correspondence with Isabel. And, most chilling of all, a series of audio cassette tapes, labeled by date and marked sessions. When detectives played them, they heard Harold's voice narrating long, rambling monologues. In them, he discussed Isabel's progress, his paternal devotion, and, in later tapes, a growing sense of obsession. He spoke of protection, purification, and preparing her for separation from the mother. One tape ended with the words, "The moment draws close. Teresa doesn't see it yet. But I must preserve Isabel. Before she's ruined." That tape was recorded 2 days before Harold's death. Detective Dawson turned her focus to Teresa Linden, a woman in her mid-40s, once a nurse's aide, now unemployed. She had met Harold in the early 2000s while working a private care job in Syracuse. At the time, she was unaware he was married. Their relationship lasted 7 years. Teresa claimed she broke things off when she found out Harold had a wife upstate. By then, Isabel had already been born. Teresa admitted Harold had stayed involved, sporadically. She never told Isabel who he really was, only that he was an old friend who helped out. She never suspected he had more sinister intentions. But Isabel told investigators something much darker. Harold, she said, had started visiting more frequently in recent years, often alone with her in the house while her mother worked. He brought gifts. Asked odd questions about her future, about boys, about how she felt living with her mother. He recorded her singing. Filmed her dancing. Told her she was the light of his legacy. She described his attention as uncomfortable, but said she didn't know how to tell her mom without causing problems. The final chilling discovery came when forensics analyzed Harold's autopsy tissue, which had been preserved as standard practice. They found traces of fentanyl, not consistent with accidental ingestion. Now the investigation flipped. Harold hadn't just died of a heart attack. He had been poisoned. The media response was swift and ravenous. Headlines ran wild with theories. Double life engineer dead in possible murder, secret daughter and poison found, from model husband to obsessed father, who killed Harold Whitmore. $950K motive. Mystery teen inherits man's entire estate, talk shows speculated. Neighbors whispered. Reporters camped outside Darlene's house. They knocked on Teresa's door. Isabel was pulled out of school and placed in protective custody while the investigation unraveled. 3 main suspects emerged: Darlene Whitmore, the betrayed wife; Teresa Linden, the hidden partner; Isabel Linden, the sole heir. All 3 denied involvement. Yet the poison suggested deliberate, intimate access. And all 3 women had it. The toxicology report cracked the silence like a thunderclap. Harold Whitmore hadn't died from a heart attack, as first believed. It was poisoning. Fentanyl, slow, precise, and deliberate, had seeped into his bloodstream over time. Not a single, fatal dose, but a methodical build-up, engineered to mimic a natural death. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't raise alarms. Until it does. Detectives had seen cover-ups before, but this was elegant. It was intimate. It reeked of proximity and patience, of someone who knew his habits, his weaknesses, his blind spots. Someone who had sat beside him, smiled across from him. Maybe even kissed him goodnight. Attention turned swiftly to Teresa Linden. The mistress. The other woman. She had motive, decades of waiting, of being lied to, of being hidden. And she had proximity. She was the last known person to see him alive. She had prepared his meals. She had brought him tea. She had been the keeper of his routine. Her arrest came quietly, under the gray cloud of an overcast afternoon. She was led away from a food bank where she volunteered, hands cuffed, face unreadable. The media erupted. The story had everything: a wealthy man, a secret family, a bitter mistress, and now, a murder charge. Teresa was charged with first-degree murder, financial fraud, and unlawful concealment of a relationship for financial gain. The prosecution painted her as a woman scorned, driven by rage and greed, who poisoned the man she once loved for a payout that would never arrive. But the defense told a different story. Teresa wasn't enraged. She was broken. Used. Cast aside. She had given 2 decades to a man who never fully gave himself in return. And when he died, she lost everything. Her partner, her home, her hope. She wasn't plotting his death. She was grieving it. Public opinion fractured. Some called her a black widow, others a tragic pawn in a crueler game. But just when the narrative seemed set in stone, the case unraveled. Forensic evidence unearthed digital traces, a device connected to Harold's Wi-Fi during his final days that didn't belong to Teresa. It belonged to someone else. Someone no one had expected. Darlene Whitmore. The wife. Harold's widow had claimed to know nothing. She'd stood at his funeral, tears rolling down her cheeks, a vision of devastation. But now, the evidence whispered a different truth. She had been at his guest house, despite claiming she hadn't. Her car's GPS placed her within blocks of his second home. And surveillance footage caught her near Teresa's neighborhood just days before Harold's death. It was subtle. It was careful. But it was there. With mounting evidence and pressure from the press, the district attorney's office dropped the charges against Teresa and turned their focus to the woman everyone had assumed was the victim. Darlene was arrested outside a flower shop, her arms full of lilies meant for Harold's grave. The headlines changed overnight. Now the story was about the wife. The woman who had discovered her husband's betrayal not through confession, but through paperwork. An unsigned will, tucked into a drawer, naming another woman and her child as heirs to a fortune. And tucked beside it, letters, photographs, journals. An entire life Harold had built in secret. To the prosecution, it was motive. Enough to drive anyone to madness. But Darlene hadn't screamed. She hadn't confronted him. She hadn't even left. She had played the long game. With her background in nursing, the state argued, she knew just how to administer fentanyl in trace amounts. Through supplements, drinks, powders. Items Harold consumed routinely. Items she offered to deliver, claiming it was for his health. The method was precise. Untraceable in the home. Invisible in the moment. And fatal over time. The trial was set for November. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution depicted Darlene as a woman consumed by humiliation. Betrayed not just by infidelity, but by erasure. She wasn't merely replaced in Harold's affections, she was erased from his future. She became the shadow to his secret, the legal roadblock he had intended to outmaneuver. And when she discovered the truth, she didn't lash out in rage. She plotted. She poisoned. She killed. But the defense had its own story. One just as haunting. They described a woman fractured by the realization that her life had been a lie. A woman who had smiled through dinner parties, managed family finances, and stood beside a man who was actively rebuilding a second home with another family. The journals she discovered weren't just proof of betrayal, they were declarations of love for someone else. A younger woman. A teenager. The defense argued that if Darlene had acted, she had done so in a state of psychological collapse, triggered by years of neglect and emotional abuse. They questioned the chain of custody on the toxicology. They challenged the reliability of digital evidence. They pushed the theory of reasonable doubt. But they couldn't erase what was already etched into the record. A blurred surveillance video of Darlene handing off a container labeled, Immune Support Blend. GPS pings aligning with Harold's final visits. A delivery service receipt in her name, left and signed on his doorstep the day before his collapse. And then there was the journal, the one entry Harold had written in desperation just days before his death. The one entry that prosecutors claimed revealed his growing suspicion. He'd begun to suspect someone was tampering with his routine. He had written that he didn't feel safe. That someone close to him had changed. That page was torn out. Found crumpled in the trash. It was the final nail in the coffin of Darlene's defense. Outside the courtroom, crowds gathered every day. Protesters held signs. Podcasters speculated. Social media raged and theorized. Was Darlene a monster? A survivor? A woman betrayed, or a murderer cloaked in grief? And what about Isabel? The girl at the center of the inheritance war had now become a symbol, of innocence lost, of secrets buried. Her name was splashed across tabloids. Her photograph dissected and shared. No longer just Harold's hidden daughter, she was now his unintended witness, his overlooked legacy, his final miscalculation. By the end of the third week of trial, everyone had lost something. Teresa had lost her freedom, her reputation, her home. Darlene had lost her husband, her sanity, and now, possibly her future. Isabel had lost her father. And perhaps, her trust in everyone. And Harold? He had lost the one thing he cherished more than his fortune, control. The legal battle was never just about who killed Harold Whitmore. It was about the people he left in his wake. The lives he splintered. The lies he nurtured. And now, justice was preparing its final move. The courtroom was silent. No rustling papers. No whispers. Even the air seemed to still. 12 jurors filed in, faces pale from the weight of decision. Months of testimony, forensic data, motive maps, character dissections, they had absorbed it all. And now, they held one woman's future in their hands. Darlene Whitmore sat motionless at the defense table. Her lawyer stared ahead, lips drawn into a single tight line. Across the aisle, the prosecution sat braced, poised not for celebration, but for closure. The judge's voice broke the stillness. Guilty. On all counts. The words floated through the courtroom like smoke. Then they hit, sharper than any gavel strike. Darlene didn't cry. She didn't flinch. Her eyes drifted toward the ceiling, as though trying to memorize the last place she'd see as a free woman. Or maybe she was searching for something, meaning, redemption, absolution. But nothing came. The sentence was swift, life in prison without the possibility of parole. The gravity of the crime, the evidence of premeditation, the betrayal masked by careful calculation, it left no room for leniency. Outside, reporters scrambled to break the news. Socialite widow found guilty of husband's murder. Double life ends in double betrayal. The story ricocheted across every platform. True crime podcasts dedicated entire seasons to dissecting it. Streaming deals were whispered about in boardrooms. Hollywood came calling. But behind the spectacle, the lives entangled in Harold Whitmore's deception began to fracture. Teresa Linden, once painted as a murderer, now bore the stain of scandal. Though legally exonerated, she found no peace. Employers shied away. Neighbors stared. Parents pulled their children away from Isabel at school. The courtroom may have declared her innocent, but society had already etched her name in the shadows. She relocated to Oregon with her daughter, leaving behind everything. Harold's house, his memory, and the city that had turned on her. Isabel, just 17, had aged a decade in a year. She didn't smile the same. She stopped attending school events. She refused interviews. The only time she appeared publicly again was at a scholarship ceremony, anonymously funded and awarded under a false last name. If this story gripped you the way it gripped us, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. Your support helps uncover more untold truths and hidden lives behind the headlines. She had once believed her father was her hero. Now, she barely spoke of him. And as for Darlene, she vanished into the prison system, becoming inmate number 447219 at Coldwater Correctional Institution. No longer the refined, composed woman who had once hosted charity luncheons and mingled with politicians, now, she existed in a 9-by-12 cell, her name reduced to a number, her voice lost among echoes of steel and regret. In the months that followed the verdict, people began to question not just the actions of one woman, but the architecture of the entire tragedy. How had Harold managed to live two lives for so long without anyone catching on? How had Teresa accepted so little for so long? How had Darlene gone from silent sufferer to calculated killer? And perhaps the most painful question of all, how many other families were fractured by secrets they never knew existed? The Whitmore Foundation, once a beacon of wealth and philanthropy, dissolved quietly. Its board members resigned. Donations dried up. The trust Harold had planned for Isabel was frozen in litigation, contested by distant relatives who had emerged from nowhere to claim a share of his tainted legacy. Even his grave became a target, vandalized twice, once with red paint, once with the words, "He lived two lies." In a quiet suburb miles away from it all, a retired detective named Mallory sat alone on her porch, rereading Harold's final journal entry. She had testified at trial. She had combed through bank records, medical timelines, text messages. But still, something about the case gnawed at her. Not doubt, no, the evidence was strong. But sorrow. Because beneath all the headlines and drama and intrigue, it had always come down to the simplest, most human of failures. Lies. Not the grand, cinematic lies. The small ones. The daily ones. The lies we tell to keep the peace. The lies we whisper to ourselves to delay the truth. Lies Harold had told to both women. Lies Darlene had told to herself. Lies Teresa had swallowed. Lies that had piled up until someone, maybe everyone, broke. And then, there was silence. A year passed. The story faded from front pages. New scandals emerged. The world moved on. But for those left behind, the ghosts lingered. In a modest apartment in Portland, Teresa hung a single photo of Harold, taken during a rare trip to the beach, Isabel curled beside him, both laughing. She kept it not for love, but for memory. To remind her that even the darkest chapters began with light. And in her prison cell, Darlene began to write. Not appeals. But memoirs. It was unclear whether anyone would ever read them. But each night, she wrote long into the darkness. Page after page. No excuses. No self-pity. Just an attempt to make sense of how a life so carefully curated could collapse so completely. And maybe that was the true punishment. Not the bars. Not the sentence. But the reckoning. Because in the end, the Whitmore case wasn't just about murder. It was about masks. And the cost of wearing them too long. If this story gripped you the way it gripped us, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. Your support helps uncover more untold truths and hidden lives behind the headlines.